1,850 German soldiers stepped off a passenger train, not cattle cars, not freight wagons, Pullman coaches, cushioned seats, dining cars with white tablecloths. These were men of the Afrika Korps, desert warriors, who had once pushed the British back to the gates of Egypt. Now they were prisoners, and the small Texas town waiting to receive them had no idea what was about to happen inside the minds of these soldiers. A German officer pressed his face against the glass as the train slowed. Electric lights blazed from every farmhouse, every street corner, every shop window. In Germany, blackout regulations had swallowed the country in darkness since 1940. Rural electrification had reached barely 20% of German farms. Yet here in the nation Nazi propaganda had called a decadent, crumbling empire, electricity flowed like water. One soldier stared at the glow hanging over the town and felt something crack inside his chest. He didn't have a word for it yet, but the feeling would only grow. To understand what these prisoners were about to witness, you have to understand what they believed. For 3 years, the Nazi regime had fed its people a single relentless message. America was weak, divided, decaying from within. Its factories were outdated. Its people were lazy. Its military was a joke. This wasn't casual propaganda. It was the architecture of belief. By 1943, ordinary German citizens could not picture an America that looked anything like reality. The gap between what they imagined and what actually existed was not a crack. It was a canyon. The collapse that brought these men to Texas began on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. General Jurgen von Arnim surrendered with nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers. The Afrika Korps, the very pride of the Wehrmacht, was finished. Among the prisoners was a man history would remember. Feldwebel Friedrich Radke, Iron Cross, First Class, veteran of France, wounded twice in North Africa. His diary, recovered decades later in a national archive, would become the most detailed first-hand account of what happened when Nazi soldiers confronted American power. Radke didn't know it then, but his captivity was about to become his education. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop your country in the comments below. Stories like this one deserve to be heard everywhere. At the processing camps outside Oran, Algeria, the Americans moved through 30,000 men with an organizational precision the Wehrmacht could not have matched at its peak. Identity cards photographed and filed. Medical records completed in hours. Geneva Convention rights explained in fluent German by officers trained specifically for this task. It was efficient. It was orderly. And it unsettled the prisoners in ways they couldn't quite articulate. Then came the food. White bread, real coffee. Meat twice a day. It was standard military ration. The prisoners hadn't yet learned that America's baseline was another nation's ceiling. The Liberty ships that carried them across the Atlantic were monuments in themselves. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. A single ship assembled at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, at a pace that would have sounded like fantasy to any German engineer. These vessels rolled off American docks at a rate of 3 per day during peak production. 2,710 Liberty ships would be built before the war ended, each one requiring 250,000 parts assembled from components manufactured across 32 states. The ocean crossing took 2 weeks. For the Germans, it felt like a slow descent into a world they had been told could not exist. The food waste aboard ship was the detail that broke something in Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division. American sailors discarded half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk. They did it openly, casually. not to mock the prisoners watching from the lower decks, simply because abundance made such waste meaningless. Zimmerman wrote it down. He kept writing for the rest of the crossing. Every detail, every observation, because somewhere beneath the shock, a question was forming in the back of his mind. If this is how they feed sailors on a cargo vessel, what does the rest of this country look like? August 2nd, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The answer hit them all at once. Norfolk sprawled across 4,300 acres. Cranes moved in endless, grinding motion. Dozens of ships loaded and unloaded simultaneously. In a single day, this one American port handled more tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg managed in a week. A factory worker turned soldier named Johann Weber counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of operation. Each crane lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses back home. They moved on electric power, silent, continuous. No coal smoke choking the air the way it choked German industrial cities. The sound was wrong, too clean, too steady. Nothing like the grinding, coughing machinery the prisoners knew from home, belonging to dock workers, ordinary laborers. In Germany, private car ownership remained a privilege of wealth and party standing. The Volkswagen had been promised to the German people since 1934. Fewer than 1,000 had ever reached civilian hands. Here, men who unloaded cargo for a living drove themselves to work every single morning. Not the 48 wagons that had hauled German troops across Europe, 40 men, or 8 horses, packed in, no dignity. Full Pullman coaches, padded seats that folded into sleeping berths, observation cars with panoramic windows. One American guard apologized that the air conditioning in their car wasn't functioning properly. Air conditioning. In August, Friedrich Radke wrote 3 words in his diary that night. We boarded tourists. Virginia gave way to Tennessee. Tennessee gave way to Kentucky. And with every mile, the prisoners saw more. Factories running night shifts, their windows blazing at midnight. Small towns lit up like cities. Parking lots full at every hour. An electrical engineer named Heinrich Müller calculated that a single railway yard they stopped at consumed more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin used in an entire day. He called it magnificent waste. Lights burning in empty buildings, fans running in vacant rooms, the carelessness of infinite resource. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched for 3 miles along the river. Its furnaces consumed 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, prisoners watched synthetic rubber plants that had risen from empty fields in just 18 months. 4 massive facilities, 800,000 tons of output annually. Germany, the nation that had invented the synthetic rubber process, had never managed more than 120,000 tons in its best year. An IG Farben chemist named Erich Hoffmann saw the distillation columns. He recognized the technology instantly. He knew exactly how advanced each plant was. And he knew there were dozens more scattered across the country. The mathematics were devastating. They were losing not just a war, they were losing an era. Then came Willow Run, Ford's bomber factory outside Detroit. Built in 9 months, a single plant producing 1 B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes, 42,000 workers, 1.5 million parts per aircraft, 2.5 million square feet of factory floor. A Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face to the glass, and counted 17 bombers in various stages of assembly, all visible from a moving train. Nazi propaganda had told him American aircraft were inferior, hastily built, fragile. He could see the precision of the assembly lines from the window. These were not inferior machines. They were simply built faster than anything he had ever imagined possible. The prisoners crossed the Mississippi at St. Louis. Below them, barges carried grain, mountains of it. More wheat in a single barge than the entire German harvest of 1942. A farmer's son from Bavaria, named Carl Schmidt, watched a crane operator loading wheat and eating a sandwich at the same time. The meat in that sandwich was thicker than Schmidt's entire weekly ration had been in Africa. He wrote it down. He wrote everything down. The habit of recording had become survival. Not physical survival. Something deeper. In Kansas City, the smell hit them before the stockyards came into view. Tens of thousands of cattle. Germans who had lived on 200 grams of meat per week when they were lucky watched. American workers eating beef sandwiches on their lunch break. One guard bought 20 hamburgers from a stand near the station without a second thought, paid with a single dollar bill. This was not a special occasion. This was a Tuesday. This was how the country fed itself. Camp Hearn, Texas, was built in 4 months. It housed up to 4,800 prisoners in wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. Each building constructed with more lumber than entire German villages possessed. The camp hospital stunned the German medical personnel most of all. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most civilian hospitals back home. X-ray machines, surgical equipment that had vanished from German supply lines by 1941, and penicillin, the miracle drug they had only heard rumors about. The Americans used it freely, even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying for want of basic sulfa drugs, and here the Americans were dispensing their most advanced medicine without hesitation to the enemy. The camp kitchen was its own kind of classroom. Walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, gas ranges that could feed 5,000 men. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread. An ex-hotel chef named Otto Krebs wept one morning as he threw perfectly good bread into the garbage. American regulations required 10% surplus to ensure every prisoner received full portions. The excess was simply discarded. Otto wrote that night that he wept not from hunger, but from the weight of understanding what he was seeing. By September, labor shortages drove the Americans to put prisoners to work across the heartland. Cotton gins, wheat fields, sugar beet farms, and the prisoners traveled without blindfolds, without restricted routes. They saw everything. A cotton gin outside Houston processed more in 1 hour than an entire German village could handle in a month using traditional methods. The farmer who owned it was nobody special, no aristocracy, no party connections, just a farmer, but he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, a tractor. His workers ate lunches from boxes containing more food than German laborers received in a week, and every farm they passed looked the same. In Nebraska, a 16-year-old boy drove a tractor worth more than everything one prisoner's father had earned in his entire lifetime. When the prisoner mentioned this, the boy laughed, said it wasn't even a good tractor. His father was waiting on a better model from John Deere. The boy said it like he was talking about the weather. Christmas 1943 arrived and shattered something that industrial power alone could not reach, something deeper than economics, something older, American churches, civic groups, ordinary families. They sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners, enemies who had been trying to kill their sons just months earlier. Each package held cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. A Methodist church choir in Herne performed Christmas carols in German for the prisoners. Women from town sent homemade cookies. Boy Scouts delivered handmade cards with drawings of snowflakes and stars. Walter Mueller, whose brother had died in the Hamburg bombing, wrote that night with trembling hands, "They know we are their enemies. Many have sons and husbands fighting against us, yet they show us genuine kindness. Only people absolutely certain of their own strength treat enemies this way." The Christmas dinner defied comprehension. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, pies, ice cream, quantities of food that Germany hadn't seen since before the First World War. The guards told them this was a normal American Christmas, that every family in the country was eating the same meal. If they could feed prisoners like kings, the prisoners wondered, what must their own soldiers be eating? By early 1944, over 40,000 Germans had enrolled in educational programs: English, American history, mathematics, sciences. The University of Chicago sent correspondence courses. Stanford sent professors to lecture on democracy. Prisoners who had been told Americans were cultural barbarians found libraries holding millions of books. Universities that welcomed all social classes. Scientific research that led the world. A physicist from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute attended lectures on atomic physics and learned from Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi Germany. They taught without hatred. They shared knowledge freely with enemies. The generosity broke something open in minds shaped by years of racial ideology. It was incomprehensible to them. And that was precisely the point. Spring 1944, the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans produced 700 landing craft per month, 20,000 workers, women operating cranes, teenagers running drilling equipment, 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. The prisoners unloading steel that were watching the boats that would storm the beaches of Normandy. They just didn't know it yet. June 6, 1944, the news reached the camps within days. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave. The scale exceeded anything Nazi Germany had dreamed possible. Prisoners watched newsreels of the invasion in camp theaters. They saw the artificial harbors, the supply lines delivering 15,000 tons per day across open beaches. They watched their homeland being crushed by the very nation they had spent years believing was too weak to fight. The screen flickered. The images kept coming. And in the silence of that theater, the war ended for these men long before it ended on the maps. Friedrich von Tauben wrote the words that carried the weight of an empire's collapse. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, courage against their unlimited resources. By March 1945, 25,000 prisoners had volunteered for democracy courses. Camp newspapers published essays on constitutional government and free markets. Officers who had sworn blood oaths to Hitler were planning how to bring American agricultural methods back to Germany. The transformation was not forced. It was not manufactured. It was the quiet, irreversible result of open eyes and honest observation. When the war ended in May 1945, 371,683 German prisoners began the journey home. They returned to a Germany divided, destroyed, and destitute. But they carried something with them that no treaty could have produced. They had seen how a free society worked. They had witnessed what ordinary people could build when they were given dignity and the freedom to create. Fewer than 1% had ever attempted escape. 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Many of these former prisoners would rise to leadership in post-war West Germany. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built, in part, on knowledge gained inside American prison camps. In 1985, over 500 former prisoners returned to Texas for a reunion. Herman Gutz, then 78 years old, stood before an audience of Americans and Germans and delivered words that still echo. We came as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats. As men who had seen the truth, America did not defeat us with bombs. It defeated us with evidence. The auditorium erupted. Former enemies standing together, applauding a truth that had taken 40 years to fully take root. America's greatest victory in the Second World War was not won on a battlefield. It was won in the minds of men who came to this country in chains and left carrying the blueprint for a better world. They had seen the arsenal of democracy at full production, and they would never be the same.